I noticed the silence before I understood the question. One moment, the ballroom at Bennett Vineyards was glowing beneath hundreds of crystal chandeliers. Investors were raising glasses of reserve Cabernet. Local officials were congratulating my father on another record-breaking year, and a jazz quartet drifted through the room so softly it almost disappeared beneath the conversations. From a distance, we looked like the kind of family magazines loved to feature: successful, elegant, untouchable. Then my grandfather looked at me. His smile was warm, the same one I'd known since I was a little girl, following him through rows of grapevines with dirt on my boots. "Claire," he said, "how's that vineyard cottage I restored for you? Still waking up to the sunrise over the east vines?" I stared at him. For a second, I honestly thought he'd mistaken me for someone else. "The cottage," he chuckled lightly. "The one I had renovated for you. Your father said you moved in nearly 2 years ago." I felt every sound inside the room disappear. I looked at my parents before I answered. My mother's wine glass was trembling. My father wasn't looking at me anymore. He was staring at the table. "Grandpa," I whispered, "I don't own a cottage. I've never owned one." The color drained from his face. "You never received the keys?" I slowly shook my head. I didn't even know there was a cottage. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. I watched my grandfather turn toward my father with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't disappointment. It looked like a man discovering that everything he'd believed for years had been built on a lie. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out the old silver pocket watch he'd carried for as long as I could remember, and closed it with a quiet click. "So," he said, his voice calm enough to make my stomach twist, "if Claire never lived there, who did?" For a few endless seconds, nobody answered my grandfather. The ballroom that had been buzzing with conversation only moments earlier became so quiet. I could hear the faint crackle of the fireplace near the stage. I looked around, wondering if someone would laugh and explain that this was all some ridiculous misunderstanding. No one did. Every pair of eyes drifted between my grandfather, my parents, and me, waiting for somebody to say something that would make sense of the question hanging over the table. My father cleared his throat first. "Dad, maybe we shouldn't do this here." His voice sounded different, tighter than usual, as though every word had to force its way out. My grandfather never took his eyes off him. "Then answer quickly." His tone wasn't loud, but I'd heard him use that voice exactly once before, years ago, when a contractor admitted he'd falsified safety reports on one of the winery's expansion projects. Back then, my grandfather hadn't raised his voice either. He had simply asked questions until the lies collapsed under their own weight. I suddenly realized he was doing the exact same thing now. My mother tried to smile, but it looked painfully unnatural. "Harold, Claire must be confused. She knows exactly what you're talking about." I turned toward her before I even realized I was moving. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "The cottage," I continued. "I've never seen it. I've never had keys. I've never signed anything. What cottage?" She couldn't answer. Instead, she looked toward my father, silently begging him to fix a problem that had already grown far beyond either of them. My grandfather slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone. His movements were calm, almost routine, but something about that frightened me more than if he'd started shouting. He unlocked the screen, scrolled through an old conversation, then turned the phone toward himself. "I don't usually keep messages this long," he said quietly. "For some reason, I never deleted these." He adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud. "Dad, Claire absolutely loves the cottage. She cried when she walked inside. Thank you for giving her such a beautiful place to start her future." He stopped reading and looked at me. "I received that text 22 months ago." I felt my chest tighten. "I never wrote that." My grandfather nodded slowly. "I know." Then he looked back at my father. "Your number sent it." My father rubbed both hands across his face before letting out a long breath. "We were going to tell you." My grandfather's expression never changed. "Tell me what?" "Things got delayed." "Delayed?" "The renovations took longer than expected." "Then why did you tell me she had already moved in?" My father didn't answer. My grandfather waited several seconds before asking another question. "Did Claire ever receive the property?" Silence. "Did she?" Another silence. "Michael." My grandfather finally said his name with enough weight that even I flinched. "Answer me." "No." That single word landed harder than any argument could have. I looked at my father, convinced there had to be more coming, some explanation that would somehow make all of this less impossible. Instead, he stared at the polished oak table as though he couldn't bear to look at either of us. My mother suddenly reached across and grabbed my hand. "Claire, sweetheart, please understand." I slowly pulled my hand away. Understand what? My own voice sounded unfamiliar. That I've been paying rent for 6 years while everyone else thought I owned a house. Tears filled her eyes. "We thought we were protecting you." I almost laughed, not because anything was funny, but because the sentence made no sense. Protecting me from what? Neither of them answered. My grandfather placed his phone on the table with remarkable care. "Claire," I looked at him. "Where do you live?" I swallowed. "Above Harrison Auto Repair, a 1-bedroom apartment." "How long?" "Almost 6 years." "You've never moved?" "No." "Why?" I hesitated, embarrassed even now. "Because it's what I could afford." My grandfather's jaw tightened. "Does your father know where you live?" I looked at my parents again before answering. "Yes, they've been there once." My grandfather slowly turned back toward them. "You visited her?" Neither of them spoke. "You saw where she was living, and you allowed me to believe she was living in the cottage I restored for her." I suddenly remembered something that had never made sense before. 2 summers earlier, I'd invited my parents over after finally repainting the apartment myself. My mother had stayed less than 5 minutes before saying she couldn't breathe because of the smell from the repair shop downstairs. My father had promised they'd come back another day for dinner. They never did. At the time, I'd convinced myself they were simply busy. Standing there now, I realized the truth was much uglier. They hadn't been uncomfortable because of my apartment. They'd been uncomfortable because every cracked wall and every leaking pipe reminded them of what they had hidden from my grandfather. My grandfather pushed his chair back and slowly stood. The movement alone was enough to silence the few remaining whispers around the ballroom. He rested one hand on his cane before looking first at me, then at my parents. "This conversation is finished." My father immediately looked relieved, but the feeling lasted only a heartbeat. "Not because it's over," my grandfather continued, "because it deserves to happen somewhere no one can interrupt it." He looked toward the ballroom entrance where his longtime executive assistant had just appeared after quietly receiving a message. "Eleanor, clear my office for tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. She nodded once without asking a single question. Then my grandfather looked back at my parents. "Bring every financial record connected to the East Vineyard cottage." My father's face lost what little color it had left. "Dad, every invoice." My grandfather didn't slow down. "Every transfer." Another step. "Every signature." His eyes settled on my father with a calmness that sent a chill through me. "Because if my granddaughter never received that cottage, I have a feeling that isn't the only thing that's been stolen." I barely remember leaving the ballroom. People stepped aside as my grandfather walked toward the private wing of the winery, and my parents followed a few paces behind him without saying a word. I trailed after them, still trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation I hadn't heard yet. Maybe paperwork had been delayed. Maybe the renovation had fallen apart. Maybe this was all some horrible misunderstanding that would make us laugh someday. But the closer we got to my grandfather's office, the less I believed any of those possibilities. The office overlooked the oldest vineyard on the estate. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed endless rows of vines stretching across the hills, while photographs documenting 50 years of harvest lined the walls. As a little girl, I used to sit on the leather sofa in the corner while Grandpa worked through stacks of contracts. He would hand me colored pencils and tell me that every great business started with people keeping their promises. At the time, I thought he was talking about selling wine. Standing there now, I realized he had been talking about something much bigger. The door closed behind us with a quiet click. Grandpa didn't invite anyone to sit. He walked to the window, looking out across the vineyard for several seconds before speaking. "No more excuses," he said without turning around. "No more protecting each other. I want the truth." My father loosened his tie and let out a slow breath. "Dad, we never meant for this to happen." Grandpa finally faced him. "Then tell me what happened." My father hesitated. The company was expanding. Cash flow became tight. The renovation budget was sitting there. He stopped. Even he seemed to realize how terrible that sounded. Grandpa didn't interrupt. He simply waited. We planned to replace the money before Claire ever found out. I stared at him. Found out? He looked at me briefly before lowering his eyes again. We thought we'd have everything fixed before your grandfather visited. It felt as though the room suddenly became smaller. So, there really was a cottage? I asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Grandpa looked at me with genuine pain in his eyes. There still is. 2 years ago, I purchased one of the original vineyard cottages on the eastern ridge. It needed extensive restoration, but I thought you'd appreciate a home with history instead of something new. My throat tightened. He remembered. Years ago, I'd told him I loved old buildings, because every scar in the wood and every crack in the stone meant somebody had cared enough to preserve them. He had remembered a conversation I'd almost forgotten myself. I wanted it to be yours, he continued softly. Not because you needed charity, because I wanted you to have a place where your life could begin without worrying about rent every month. I couldn't find the words to answer him. Instead, I looked at my parents. You knew that? My mother nodded through tears. Yes. You knew he bought it for me? Another nod. Then why? My voice cracked before I could finish the sentence. Why did you let me keep struggling? My mother covered her face with both hands. My father answered instead. We thought you'd become dependent. I actually laughed. It came out as a short, disbelieving breath. Dependent? I've been supporting myself since I graduated. My father rubbed his forehead. You don't understand the pressure we were under. Then explain it to me. He couldn't. Grandpa walked slowly toward the conference table and rested both hands on its polished surface. Claire, I looked at him. Where exactly are you living? I felt embarrassed answering the question inside that beautiful office, but there was no point hiding anything anymore. A 1-bedroom apartment above Harrison Auto Repair in Santa Rosa. How much is your rent? $1,900 a month, Grandpa frowned. For that neighborhood? I nodded. It keeps going up. How's the apartment? I hesitated. It's livable. He looked at me for another second. Claire. I sighed quietly. The plumbing barely works. The heater breaks every winter. When it rains hard, water comes through one corner of the ceiling, so I keep a bucket in the hallway. Nobody moved. The landlord keeps promising to replace the roof. Maybe this year. I watched something inside my grandfather break. Not dramatically, not with tears, just a quiet expression that seemed to age him years in the space of a few seconds. He looked at my father again. You knew. My father didn't answer. You visited her apartment. Still nothing. You saw how she was living. Silence. And every time I called to ask how she liked the cottage, you lied. My father finally looked up. I was trying to protect the family. No, Grandpa shook his head slowly. You were protecting yourself. The room fell silent again. Outside the windows, workers continued driving tractors between the vineyards, completely unaware that the Bennett family was unraveling only a few hundred yards away. I found myself staring at one of the old harvest photographs hanging on the wall. In it, I couldn't have been older than 8. Grandpa had lifted me onto an empty wine barrel because I wanted to see over the grapevines. I remembered asking him if everything here would belong to Dad one day. He'd smiled and told me something I hadn't understood back then. This place will belong to whoever remembers why it was built. I never asked what he meant. Now I wished I had. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Before anyone responded, the door opened and Eleanor stepped inside, carrying a slim leather portfolio. She'd worked beside my grandfather for nearly 30 years, and I'd never once seen her interrupt a private meeting unless something truly mattered. She handed the folder to Grandpa, leaned close enough to whisper something I couldn't hear, then quietly left the room. Grandpa didn't open the portfolio immediately. Instead, he looked at my parents. I asked for the renovation records last night. I also asked Eleanor to verify a few transactions before this meeting. For the first time that morning, I saw real fear flash across my father's face. Grandpa rested his hand on the unopened portfolio. The missing cottage was the reason I started asking questions, but after what Eleanor found, I'm no longer convinced the cottage was the biggest lie you've told me. I couldn't stop looking at the leather portfolio sitting beneath my grandfather's hand. It wasn't very thick, yet somehow it felt heavier than anything else in the room. Whatever was inside had changed the way he looked at my father. Just 24 hours earlier, he'd believed he was dealing with one terrible decision. Now, I had the unsettling feeling he was beginning to question years of decisions he had never thought to examine. Grandpa finally opened the folder. He didn't rush. He removed several documents, laid them neatly across the conference table, and looked toward my father before speaking. Last October, one of our outside auditors noticed irregular maintenance expenses tied to several vineyard properties. My father immediately frowned. Auditors find mistakes all the time. Grandpa nodded. They do. He slid the first document across the table. That's why I asked Eleanor to review them. My father barely glanced at the paperwork before pushing it back. Then this has nothing to do with Claire. That's where you're wrong, Grandpa replied quietly. Everything started with the cottage. I leaned forward, trying to understand the numbers covering the page. Most of them meant nothing to me. Property maintenance, contractor payments, vendor invoices. They looked like ordinary business records. Grandpa noticed the confusion on my face. These are renovation expenses for the East Vineyard cottage. I looked closer. They seemed normal. At first glance, he handed me another copy of what appeared to be the exact same invoice. Now compare them. It took me several seconds before I spotted it. The contractor's name matched. The project description matched. Even the invoice number matched. Only one figure was different. One document showed $84,000. The other listed almost $300,000. I looked up. These can't both be real. They aren't. Grandpa's voice remained perfectly calm. The contractor confirmed he only issued one invoice. My stomach tightened. So someone changed it? He nodded. Someone inside this company. My eyes drifted toward my father almost instinctively. He raised both hands. I never touched those invoices. Grandpa didn't argue. Instead, he slid another document across the table. This authorization carries your executive approval. My father picked it up, studied it for several long seconds, then shook his head. That's my signature, but I didn't sign this document. The room became silent again. For the first time since all of this had started, I couldn't immediately tell whether he was lying. Grandpa seemed to notice my uncertainty. Forgery is possible, he admitted, which is why I kept investigating. He reached for another file. This one concerns company property purchases over the last 4 years. I watched Eleanor's handwritten notes covering the margins of almost every page. Dates had been circled, transactions highlighted, cross-references connected with colored tabs. It wasn't the work of someone trying to trap a family member. It was the work of someone desperately hoping they were wrong. Grandpa exhaled slowly. I wanted to find one accounting error. He looked at me. I found dozens. My father leaned forward. Dad, businesses our size process thousands of transactions every month. They do. So mistakes happen. They do. You can't assume. I haven't assumed anything, Grandpa interrupted without raising his voice. I verified every document before bringing it into this room. He opened the final section of the portfolio. What concerns me isn't the missing money. He looked directly at my father. It's the pattern, I frowned. What pattern? Grandpa answered without taking his eyes off him. Every questionable payment required executive approval. I looked down at the pages again. The same signature appeared over and over. Michael Bennett. My father immediately spoke. I signed hundreds of approvals every month. I know. I couldn't possibly remember everyone. I know. So why are we acting like this proves something? Grandpa rested both hands on the table. Because every fraudulent approval happened while you were the only executive authorized to release renovation funds. Nobody spoke. Outside the office windows, vineyard workers continued moving equipment between the rows of vines. Completely unaware that inside the building, decades of trust were being dismantled one document at a time. Then something occurred to me. I looked at Grandpa. You said this started last October. Yes. Why didn't you tell anyone? A faint, tired smile crossed his face. Because I was hoping I'd discover an innocent explanation before accusing my own son. The answer hurt more than I expected. He hadn't been building a case against my father. He had been searching for a reason to believe him. Grandpa slowly closed the folder and reached into his jacket for the silver pocket watch. He rolled it gently between his fingers before opening the cover. I noticed him looking at the small photograph of us taken during harvest season, nearly 20 years earlier. I built this company believing trust had to be earned. He closed the watch. Somewhere along the way, I confused trust with assumption. At that exact moment, Eleanor's phone vibrated. She glanced at the screen, frowned, then looked toward Grandpa. "Sir, what is it?" The IT department finished recovering the deleted archive. My father froze. Eleanor continued. "They found security footage from last night. Nobody in the room moved." Grandpa slowly looked at my father. "What footage?" Eleanor swallowed. "Someone entered the records archive after 11 o'clock, and according to the access log, they used your executive security credentials. For the first time since this nightmare began." I watched my father's confidence disappear. For several long seconds, my father didn't say anything. He simply stared at Eleanor as though he hadn't heard her correctly. Then he let out a short laugh that sounded forced even to him. "Security credentials?" he said. "That doesn't prove I was there. Half the executive team has access to my office." Eleanor didn't argue. She simply turned her laptop toward my grandfather and clicked once. "The access log only tells us whose credentials opened the archive," she said calmly. "The surveillance footage tells us who actually walked through the door." The screen came to life. A grainy black and white image showed the underground hallway leading to the records archive. The timestamp read 11:42 p.m., only a few hours after the anniversary gala had ended. A man wearing a dark baseball cap appeared at the end of the hallway, looked briefly over his shoulder, then unlocked the archive door. My father immediately leaned forward. "You can't even see his face," Eleanor nodded. "Not from this camera." She clicked again. Fortunately, there was another one. The next video appeared from a different angle. This time, the image was painfully clear. The man removed his cap for just a moment while adjusting the archive keycard. It was my father. No one needed to say it. I already knew. My mother knew. Even my father knew. He slowly leaned back in his chair, his face completely drained of color. He whispered. "It wasn't." His voice disappeared. Grandpa didn't look angry, and that frightened me more than anything. He watched the video until it ended, then quietly asked, "What were you looking for?" My father swallowed. "I wasn't stealing anything." "I didn't ask if you were stealing." Grandpa's voice remained steady. "I asked what you were looking for." Another silence. Finally, my father lowered his head. "The renovation files." "Why?" "Because I knew you'd ask for them." "And?" "I wanted time." "Time for what?" "So I could explain." Grandpa gave a slow, disappointed nod. "No," he folded his hands together. "You wanted time to decide which version of the truth to tell me." No one argued with him because no one could. Eleanor opened another folder. "Mr. Bennett," she said, looking toward my grandfather, "there's one more document." Grandpa generated a gesture for her to continue. She placed a single sheet of paper in front of him. "It was recovered from the archive server this morning." He read it silently. His expression changed, not dramatically, but just enough for me to know this document mattered more than everything we'd discussed so far. "What is it?" I asked. Grandpa looked at me before sliding the paper across the table. "It's an internal authorization." I read the first few lines, then my eyes stopped. The document wasn't approving renovations. It wasn't approving maintenance. It authorized transferring ownership of the East Vineyard cottage from Bennett Vineyards to Michael Bennett. I looked up so quickly my chair almost tipped over. "What?" My father closed his eyes. "It was temporary," I laughed in disbelief. "Temporary? You transferred my cottage into your own name?" "It wasn't supposed to stay that way." "When exactly were you planning to tell me?" He couldn't answer because there wasn't one. Grandpa slowly stood. His movements were deliberate, controlled, almost painfully calm. "I gave you responsibility." He looked directly at my father. "You treated it like opportunity. I gave you authority. You treated it like ownership. I gave you trust. You treated it like permission." Every sentence landed heavier than the one before. My father finally looked up. "I spent 30 years building this company. So did I. I sacrificed everything. So did I. I deserved more." Grandpa's eyes never left his son's. "You deserved exactly what your character could sustain." The room fell silent again. Then, for the first time that morning, Grandpa reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded envelope instead of the silver pocket watch. The paper looked old, its edges softened from being carried for months. He placed it gently on the conference table. I wasn't planning to show anyone this until after my retirement. My father frowned. What is it? My final succession letter. His breathing visibly changed. You already decided? Yes. When? 6 months ago. I looked back and forth between them. 6 months. That meant long before the anniversary dinner. Long before the missing cottage. Long before any of this. My father seemed to reach the same realization, his voice becoming almost desperate. You replaced me. Before you even knew about the cottage. Grandpa nodded. I did. But why? For the first time all morning, my grandfather's eyes filled with sadness. Because leadership isn't measured by quarterly profits. He gently rested his hand on the envelope. It's measured by what a person does when no one is watching. He looked toward the paused surveillance footage still frozen on the screen behind us. Unfortunately, someone was watching. I watched my father's shoulders collapse. Not from losing the company, not from losing the cottage, but from realizing the hardest truth of all. The lies hadn't cost him his future. His character had. And at that moment, I understood something that changed the way I'd viewed my grandfather my entire life. He hadn't spent months trying to find a reason to disinherit his son. He had spent months desperately hoping he'd find a reason not to. I didn't remember walking out of the boardroom. One moment I was sitting there, staring at the succession letter lying on the table. The next, I found myself standing outside on the stone terrace overlooking the vineyards. The afternoon sun hung low over the hills, washing the rows of vines in soft shades of gold. Employees continued working as though nothing had happened. Tractors moved between the fields. Forklifts carried pallets toward the production building. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear laughter coming from the bottling warehouse. Life had already started moving forward, even though mine still felt suspended somewhere between disbelief and acceptance. The terrace door opened quietly behind me. I didn't have to turn around to know it was Grandpa. He walked beside me and rested both hands on his cane before looking across the vineyard. I used to stand here every evening, he said softly, back when there were only 12 acres and one old tractor that barely started. I smiled faintly. You've told me that story. I know, he chuckled. I guess old men repeat the stories they hope people won't forget. For a while, neither of us spoke. The silence felt different now, not awkward, not painful, just peaceful. Finally, I asked the question that had been sitting in the back of my mind since the board meeting ended. Did you really decide 6 months ago? He nodded. I did. What made you choose then? He took a slow breath before answering. I wasn't looking for a successor anymore. I frowned. What were you looking for? A steward. He looked toward the endless rows of vines stretching across the valley. Anyone can inherit a business. He paused. Very few people know how to protect one. I thought about everything that had happened over the last 24 hours. The missing cottage, the forged invoices, the surveillance footage, the succession letter. It all seemed impossible. I keep thinking I should have noticed something sooner. Grandpa gently shook his head. No? I should have asked more questions. You trusted your parents. I did. And I trusted my son. He smiled sadly. Trust isn't foolish, Claire. It's refusing to face the truth after you see it that becomes foolish. Those words stayed with me, not because they erased the pain, but because they finally gave it meaning. A week later, the legal transfer of the East Vineyard cottage was completed. I didn't celebrate. I didn't invite photographers. I didn't post anything online. Grandpa simply handed me an old brass key while we stood inside the empty cottage one quiet morning. This belonged to the original owner, he said. They asked me to keep it after we bought the property. I turned the key over in my hand. It wasn't polished. It wasn't valuable. Years of use had worn its edges smooth. I think it belongs here. I unlocked the front door myself. Sunlight poured through the restored windows, filling every room with warm afternoon light. The original oak floors had been refinished instead of replaced. The stone fireplace still carried small imperfections left by the mason who built it nearly 90 years earlier. Every detail reflected exactly what I'd always loved about historic buildings. Nothing was perfect. Everything was honest. I walked from room to room without saying a word. When I reached the back porch overlooking the eastern vineyard, I finally understood why Grandpa had chosen this place. It wasn't the largest house on the property. It wasn't the most expensive. It was simply the one that felt most alive. Grandpa joined me a few minutes later. "You know," he said, smiling toward the vineyard, "I always imagined you'd complain that the kitchen was too small." I laughed. "I would've. I know, but you also would have figured out how to make it feel like home." He was right. That was exactly what I planned to do. Over the next several months, I moved into the cottage one room at a time. I restored old furniture instead of buying new pieces. I filled the bookshelves with architectural history books, family photographs, and notebooks from restoration projects I'd worked on over the years. The small workshop behind the house became a place where I repaired antique windows and handcrafted doors, rescued from buildings that would otherwise have been demolished. Every evening, when the last rays of sunlight reached the porch, I'd sit outside with a cup of coffee and watch the workers finish another day in the vineyard. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't calculating rent in the back of my mind. I wasn't wondering whether the heater would survive another winter or whether another storm would send water dripping through the ceiling. I finally understood what security actually felt like. Grandpa officially retired that autumn. To everyone's surprise, he didn't appoint another family member as chairman. Instead, he created an independent board of directors and a permanent family trust designed to ensure that no single heir could ever control Bennett Vineyards without accountability again. Some investors questioned the decision at first. A year later, most of them admitted it had been one of the smartest changes in the company's history. As for my parents, life became quieter. Neither of them disappeared. Neither of them was publicly humiliated. Grandpa refused to let the family become another headline. "They'll spend enough time living with their own choices," he told me once. "The world doesn't need another public spectacle." My relationship with them changed forever. There were conversations, there were apologies, some sincere, some unfinished. Forgiveness didn't happen all at once, and trust certainly didn't return overnight. But I also realized forgiveness wasn't the same thing as pretending the past had never happened. Sometimes the healthiest relationship two people can have begins only after every illusion between them has been stripped away. One evening, nearly a year after the anniversary gala, Grandpa and I sat on the porch watching another harvest come to an end. The vineyard looked almost exactly as it had the day he'd first asked me about the cottage, yet everything inside me had changed. He reached into his jacket and handed me the old silver pocket watch. "I think it's time." I looked at him. "I can't take this." "Yes, you can. It belongs to you," he smiled. It never belonged to me. I opened the cover. The same childhood photograph was still there. Behind it, folded neatly inside the case, was a small handwritten note. "Never measure your life by what people leave you. Measure it by what you're willing to protect for those who come after you." I looked back at Grandpa. "When did you write this?" He laughed quietly. "About 20 years ago." "You knew you'd give it to me?" "I hoped I would." I slipped the watch into my jacket pocket and looked across the vineyard one last time before the sun disappeared beyond the hills. For years, I believed the greatest thing my grandfather had given me was a home. I was wrong. The cottage gave me a place to live. His trust gave me a reason to become the person I'd always wanted to be. And whenever someone asked me what Bennett Vineyards truly passed down from one generation to the next, I never mentioned the land, the company, or the fortune. I tell them about an old silver pocket watch. And the afternoon one honest question proved that character will always outlast inheritance. As I walked back toward the cottage that evening, I realized something I hadn't understood for most of my life. I used to believe inheritance was about receiving something valuable, a house, a company, land that had belonged to generations before me. But Grandpa had spent years trying to teach me something much deeper. Those things were never the inheritance. They were only the responsibility that came after it. The real inheritance was learning how to make decisions when nobody could force you to choose the right one. It was choosing honesty when deception would have been easier, choosing responsibility when entitlement seemed more rewarding, and choosing people over pride. Looking back now, I don't think my grandfather ever wanted me to become the next owner of Bennett Vineyards. He wanted me to become the next guardian of its values. There's a difference. Owners can sell what they receive. Guardians protect it for the people who come after them. That's the lesson hidden inside an old vineyard cottage, and inside a silver pocket watch, that still sits on my desk every single day. Whenever life presents me with a difficult decision, I don't ask myself what would make me wealthier. I ask myself the same question Grandpa quietly answered with his own life. Will this decision leave something better behind than what I was given? If the answer is yes, I know I'm walking the right path. And if my story has taught me anything, it's this. The people who truly love you will never ask you to betray your values just to make them comfortable. Real family doesn't compete with your integrity. They protect it. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, thank you. Now I'd genuinely love to hear what you think. If you had been sitting at that anniversary dinner and discovered your own parents had hidden something that changed your entire life, would you have forgiven them, or would trust have been impossible to rebuild? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read as many of them as I can because every perspective tells a different story. And if you enjoy emotional family dramas, stories about betrayal, redemption, unexpected justice, and the kind of endings that stay with you long after they're over, don't forget to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting for you. Until next time, take care of the people who prove they deserve your trust, because character will always outlast inheritance.